He pretended to be bankrupt to test his fiancée, but what she said changed everything. Welcome, dear readers, to a journey through time and the human heart. Today, we will delve into a story that reminds us of forgotten truths, that true love is not measured in tests, but in trust, that honesty is worth more than all fortunes, and that some scars teach us more about ourselves than any victory ever could. You are about to meet Lady Genevieve Windermere, a young woman of quiet dignity, who faces the greatest test of her life, not of her character, but of the character of the one who was supposed to love her. This is a story of elaborate deceptions and simple truths, of wounded pride and hard-won humility, of a love that was almost lost in the shadows of mistrust. Before we begin, I would love to know, where are you joining us from on this journey? Leave your city and country in the comments. I love to know who is on the other side of this story. And if you appreciate narratives that touch the soul, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Every gesture of yours helps me continue bringing stories that make us reflect on what truly matters. Now take a deep breath. Let the modern world dissolve for a few moments. Let us return to a time when letters were written by candlelight, when the creak of carriages echoed on cobblestone roads, and where the human heart faced dilemmas as real as ours today. Victorian England, county of Thornbury, the year 1881. The story begins on a misty March morning, when a young lord discovers that his inheritance depends not on his lineage, but on the purity of a feeling he no longer knows if he can trust. The March fog hung over Thornbury Hall like a veil of untold secrets. Lord Gideon Thornbury stood before the mahogany office window, watching as the mist devoured the gardens that had once witnessed his childhood, a childhood marked by the sound of slamming doors and broken promises. His fingers unconsciously traced the scar that cut across his left jaw, a physical reminder of a past that refused to fade. He was only 7 when his mother left, leaving behind a shattered husband and a confused son, the same mother who, while packing her bags in that cold dawn, had knocked over the oil lamp that had marked him forever, a mark not just on his skin, but on his ability to trust. There are precisely 3 months until your 30th birthday, my lord. Mr. Bartholomew Fletcher's voice cut through the silence like a sharp blade. The family lawyer adjusted his spectacles with meticulous fingers, leafing through time-yellowed documents. Your grandfather's will is clear and irrevocable. Gideon turned slowly. The grey morning light cast shadows on his aristocratic face, accentuating the features of one who carried the weight of generations. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that contrasted with eyes of a stormy blue, he was a man who could have everything, except what he needed most: certainty. To marry before I am 30, he murmured, each word as heavy as a stone. To a woman who loves me for myself, not for the Thornbury fortune. The lawyer nodded gravely. The floorboards creaked under his steps as he approached the desk where generations of Thornburys had signed contracts, wills, and love letters that should never have been written. Your grandfather witnessed the destruction caused by your father's marriage. Lady Catherine, Fletcher paused, choosing his words carefully. She left your father for a man whose fortune was greater, but whose character was inferior. The old Earl did not want that curse to be repeated. He wanted to ensure that the next Thornbury marriage would be based on something more enduring than gold. Gideon walked to the cold fireplace. The cold ashes were a reminder of other winter's fires, of other disillusionments. Thornbury Hall breathed history. Every tapestry on the walls, every portrait of stern ancestors, every piece of furniture polished by generations of loyal servants spoke of permanence. But permanence, Gideon had learned early, was a cruel illusion. And if I fail? He asked without looking at the lawyer. The estate and the fortune will be distributed among charitable institutions. You will retain the title, but without the means to sustain it. The silence that followed was dense, inhabited by the ghosts of choices not yet made. Through the window, Gideon watched a lone gardener pruning still dormant rose bushes. Life and death, growth and pruning. Everything followed cycles he could no longer comprehend. That night, at the club where gentlemen debated politics and business between puffs of expensive cigars, Gideon sat in a corner, listening. Lord Pemberton spoke of a young woman who feigned affection to climb the social ladder. Another, whose name was lost in the thick smoke, recounted how he had discovered his wife had married for convenience, not for love. The stories multiplied like weeds, each one feeding the paranoia that grew in Gideon's chest like a poisonous plant. How could one know if love was real, when the entire world seemed like an elaborate performance? The question haunted him through the silent corridors of Thornbury Hall, echoing in empty rooms where his mother had once sung lullabies that turned out to be melodious lies. And it was this question, like a seed planted in the fertile soil of mistrust, that would germinate into something that would nearly destroy the only real chance of happiness Gideon Thornbury would ever have. The mansion's clocks ticked away the hours with mechanical indifference. 3 months, 90 days to find something he wasn't sure even existed anymore, a pure love in a world corrupted by ambition. But fate, with its peculiar irony, had already placed before him exactly what he was looking for. He just didn't know how to recognize it. And perhaps that was the greatest test of all. Not hers, but his. The 1881 London season had arrived with its promises of lavish balls and advantageous marriages. The drawing rooms of high society sparkled with crystal chandeliers that reflected not just light, but hopes, despairs, and ambitions carefully disguised beneath polite smiles. It was in one of these ballrooms, at the ball hosted by the Duchess of Ashford, that Gideon first saw Lady Genevieve Windermere. She stood by a marble column, slightly apart from the whirlwind of colours and laughter that dominated the room. Her gown was of a sky-blue silk, simple compared to the elaborate creations of the other young ladies, but in that simplicity there was an elegance that did not need to shout to be noticed. Her honey-brown hair was swept up in a delicate chignon, with a few rebellious strands framing a face of soft features and eyes that seemed to hold untold stories. But it wasn't her beauty that captured Gideon's attention. It was something more subtle, the way she observed the ballroom, not with the anxiety of one seeking a suitor, but with the serenity of someone who had already learned that not all that glitters is worth pursuing. There was a quiet dignity in her posture, a restrained strength that spoke of battles fought far from the prying eyes of society. "Lady Genevieve Windermere," Lord Tobias Grimsby whispered in Gideon's ear, noticing his friend's interest. "Daughter of Viscount Windermere, an old family, but," he paused meaningfully, "their finances have not kept up with their lineage. This is her first season. At 22, she's considered late for the marriage market." Gideon didn't reply. His eyes remained fixed on her, watching how Genevieve accepted a glass of champagne from a tray, how she smiled politely at an older lady, how her fingers distractedly caressed the simple brooch on her dress, a gesture that revealed a carefully hidden nervousness. When he finally approached and asked for a dance, she looked up at him with an expression that blended surprise and caution. Her hand, when he took it, was small but firm, and as they began to waltz, Gideon realized she danced with a natural grace, not the perfected technique of young women who spent months preparing to win wealthy husbands. "My lord," she said softly, her voice like the sound of dry leaves underfoot on an autumn day, "forgive my curiosity, but you seem to have been observing me for some time. Is there something that intrigues you?" Her frankness disarmed him. He had expected calculated coquetry, not direct honesty. "It intrigues me, Lady Genevieve, why you are standing alone when the ballroom is filled with eager gentlemen." A smile touched her lips, but it was a sad, knowing smile. "Perhaps because I have learned that chosen solitude is preferable to company that diminishes us." In that moment, something stirred in Gideon's chest, a forgotten sensation, like an atrophied muscle slowly coming back to life. They talked through 3 consecutive waltzes, ignoring the curious glances that followed them. She spoke of books, of the countryside, of how she had managed her father's estate after her mother's death. She never mentioned money, title, or position. She spoke like someone who understood that life was made of things more substantial than gold. The weeks that followed were a discreet courtship, walks in Kensington Gardens, where the first spring flowers defied the lingering cold, conversations at literary soirees, where she quoted poets with the passion of someone who had found refuge in words, carriage rides through the city, where the silence between them was comfortable, not awkward. Gideon found himself thinking of her when he woke, when he slept, in every empty moment between obligations. She was not like the others. There was an authenticity in every word, every gesture, or so he wanted to believe. The marriage proposal happened at the Grand Thornbury Estate Ball, a month after their first meeting. The ballroom was illuminated by 1,000 candles, the crystal, chandeliers pouring golden light over guests who represented the best of English society. Gideon led Genevieve to the terrace, where the full moon bathed the gardens in liquid silver. When he knelt, holding the ring that had belonged to his grandmother, an emerald surrounded by small diamonds, he saw tears glistening in her eyes. She extended a trembling hand and whispered a single word. Yes, the kiss that sealed their engagement was soft, hesitant, like the first ray of sun after a long night. And for a moment, a brief, luminous moment, Gideon allowed himself to believe he had found what he was looking for. But when they returned to the ballroom, hand in hand, announcing their engagement to applause and congratulations, something dark began to creep into his mind. Had she accepted too quickly? Was the sparkle in her eyes upon seeing Thornbury Hall one of love or financial relief? The doubts, like whispering serpents, began to poison the joy of that night, and Gideon, trapped in his own web of mistrust, decided he needed to know the truth, even if it cost him everything. What he didn't know was that the truth has a much higher price than well-told lies. The decision came 3 nights after the engagement, in a conversation fueled by brandy and a guilty conscience in Gideon's somber office. Lord Tobias Grimsby, his friend since their Cambridge days, leaned back in the leather armchair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass with thoughtful fingers. "A test," Tobias said, the word hanging in the air like smoke. "Simple but effective. Pretend you've lost everything. If she leaves, you'll have your answer. If she stays—" He left the sentence unfinished, a cynical smile playing on his lips. Gideon stared at the fireplace, where the flames danced a chaotic waltz. The scar on his jaw throbbed, as it always did when memories of his mother returned. Her leaving in the pre-dawn hours, the sound of coffers being shut, the lamp falling, the fire kissing his childish skin as she didn't even look back. "It's cruel," he murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's necessary," Tobias retorted. "Would you rather discover her true nature now or years later, when there are children, and your fortune is irrevocably intertwined with hers?" The logic was poisonous yet seductive, and Gideon, consumed by the paranoia that had grown like ivy over the walls of his heart, agreed. The performance began like a macabre symphony. Gideon summoned every servant of Thornbury Hall to the main hall. Mrs. Caldwell, the grey-haired housekeeper, who had raised him after his mother's departure, frowned as he explained the plan. Her hands, calloused from years of loyal service, trembled slightly as she clutched her apron. "My lord," she said, her voice carrying the authority of one who had changed his diapers, "this is not right. A Lady Genevieve is a good young woman." "Mrs. Caldwell," Gideon interrupted, his voice as cold as the marble sculptures that decorated the hall. "Those are orders. I want everyone to whisper about financial difficulties. Close the east and west wings of the mansion. Dismiss half of the temporary staff. Spread the word that investments in Indian railways have ruined us." The woman lowered her eyes, but he saw the disappointment in them, a disappointment that hurt more than it should have. In the following days, Thornbury Hall transformed into a theatre of carefully orchestrated lies. Rooms were sealed with rusty locks. Paintings by Dutch masters were removed from the walls, leaving lighter rectangles on the faded paint. Ghosts of beauty supposedly sold off. The stables, once filled with racehorses, now housed only 3 animals, the least valuable ones. Gideon dismissed his personal valet, starting to wear simpler attire, without the silver buttons and imported silk handkerchiefs. He let his beard grow slightly, cultivating the appearance of a man overwhelmed by worries. Mr. Fletcher, reluctant but obedient, prepared false documents detailing the financial catastrophe. Letters from imaginary bankers, reports of staggering losses, notices from non-existent creditors, all meticulously forged to create a convincing narrative of complete ruin. And as he constructed this architecture of deceit, Gideon told himself it was necessary, that it was prudent, that it was what any sensible man would do. But at night, when the mansion fell silent and he was alone with his thoughts, a small voice whispered that he was wrong. That voice sounded strangely like Mrs. Caldwell's, like his grandfather's, like every good man he had once aspired to be. He silenced it with brandy and rationalization. The letter inviting Genevieve for an extended prenuptial visit was written on plain paper, without the family crest. When she arrived, everything would be ready. The trap would be set, and he would finally know if the love he saw in her brown eyes was real, or just another beautiful lie, like all the others that had destroyed his family. What Gideon didn't realize, as he descended each step on this staircase of mistrust, was that he was testing not only Genevieve, but himself, and that some tests, once started, cannot be undone, only survived or destroyed by them. The carriages that bring visitors can also bring judgment, and sometimes the one who judges ends up being judged. Genevieve arrived on an April afternoon, when the sky was torn between sun and rain. Her carriage, modest, pulled by 2 horses that already knew difficult roads, stopped before Thornbury Hall, which now seemed a diminished version of itself. Shuttered windows, slightly neglected gardens, a palpable melancholy hanging over the ancient stones. She stepped down with the help of Prudence, her personal maid, a young woman with a round face and observant eyes. Genevieve wore a pearl-grey traveling suit, simple but well cut, and carried only a small suitcase, a woman who had learned to travel light through life. Gideon awaited her in the entrance hall, and for the first time since starting this charade, he felt shame burn in his chest like a live coal. She smiled upon seeing him, a genuine smile that lit up her face, and he almost gave up on everything right then and there. "Gideon," she said softly, using his first name without the formal title for the first time. The intimacy of the gesture pierced him like an arrow. The first few days were ones of mutual observation. Gideon showed her the estate, pointing to wings closed for economy, casually mentioning recent difficulties. He watched her every reaction, every expression that crossed that delicate face, searching for signs of disappointment, horror, regret. But Genevieve just listened, her eyes scanning the empty corridors with a thoughtful expression he couldn't decipher. It was on the fifth night, after a simple dinner served in the small dining room instead of the great hall, another performance of austerity, that Gideon finally set the final scene. They were in the office, where a modest fire warmed the room. He served wine in glasses that were no longer crystal, another detail of the performance. "Genevieve," he began, his voice carefully modulated to sound defeated, "there is something I must tell you, something that will change everything between us." She set down her glass, her hands resting in her lap with a tranquility that seemed too artificial to be real. Or was it too real to be artificial? He could no longer tell the difference. "The investments," he continued, each word as heavy as lead, "the Indian railways, everything is lost. The Thornbury fortune," he paused dramatically, "it no longer exists." The silence that followed was dense, broken only by the crackling of the burning logs. Genevieve remained still, her face a mask of serenity he had not expected. There were no tears, no accusations, no hasty departure that he secretly feared and hoped for. Finally she spoke. 7 words Gideon would never forget. "Then we shall rebuild from the ashes, my lord." He blinked, confused. This wasn't in the script he had imagined. She was supposed to be shocked, to question, to show signs of hesitation. "You don't understand," he insisted, almost desperate to provoke the expected reaction. "There is nothing. Thornbury Hall may be lost. The title will remain, but with no means to support it. We will be poor." Genevieve rose, moving to the window where the crescent moon hung in the sky like a silver scythe. Her silhouette against the nightlight was of a melancholy beauty that cut his heart in an unexpected way. "When my mother died," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of old memories, "I was 12. My father. He lost himself in his grief. The estate began to wither like a plant without water. I learned to manage land, to negotiate with suppliers, to make every coin count for 2. I learned that true wealth is not in coffers but in character." She turned to face him, her eyes shining with a fierce determination. "My parents married against their family's wishes. My mother was a doctor's daughter with no title, no dowry, but my father loved her and she him, and they built a life based on something more solid than gold, mutual respect." She paused. "Trials reveal character. They do not destroy it. I hope to become your wife, Gideon, not your fortune." He stood paralyzed, each of her words dismantling the defenses he had built. She approached, taking his hands that were trembling imperceptibly. "If we must sell Thornbury Hall, we will sell it. If we must work with our own hands, we will work. But do not push me away because of circumstances you cannot control." And then, with a gesture that left him speechless, Genevieve removed the pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother, her most precious possession, and placed it on the desk. "Sell this. It is all I have of value, but I offer it to you gladly. We will start again, together." Gideon looked at the necklace, old pearls gleaming in the firelight, and felt something break inside him. Not the conviction that he was right, but the fear that he might be terribly wrong. That night, while Genevieve slept in the guest room, confident in her decision to stay, Gideon lay awake, staring at the ornate ceiling with frescoes of angels that seemed to be judging him. She had passed the test. Or had he failed it? And what if the only thing he was testing was his own ability to recognize love when he finally found it? The weeks that followed transformed Thornbury Hall in ways Gideon had never imagined. Genevieve, believing in the charade of financial ruin with a faith that cut like a sharp blade, became a force of nature, quiet, efficient, and relentless in her determination to preserve what could be saved. She woke with the sun, long before any lady of high society would consider appropriate. Gideon watched her in secret, hidden behind heavy curtains, seeing her walk through the dew-kissed gardens, inspecting flower beds, assessing what could be grown to reduce food costs. Her hands, delicate hands he had imagined holding only fans and books, began to show small calluses of someone not afraid of honest work. Mrs. Caldwell, initially reluctant to maintain the farce, found herself genuinely impressed. Genevieve would sit with her in the kitchen, learning to mend linens, to make soap from animal fat, to turn leftovers into substantial meals. The housekeeper, whose grey hair had witnessed 3 generations of Thornburys, murmured one morning, "She is different from the others, my lord. Different even from the good ones. There is something rare about her." Gideon merely nodded, unable to form words to explain the turmoil in his chest. Genevieve created a household budget so meticulous it seemed the work of an experienced accountant. She negotiated with suppliers, gruff men accustomed to dealing only with butlers, securing a 35% reduction in monthly expenses. She did this with a diplomacy that blended natural charm and unwavering firmness, always smiling, always polite, but never yielding more than was sensible. In the afternoons, she worked alongside the maids. Prudence, her own maid, tried to protest, but Genevieve just laughed, a laugh that sounded like a distant bell on a Sunday morning. "Prudence, my hands will not break from scrubbing a floor or polishing silverware, and perhaps by working together, we will learn something no drawing room can teach, that dignity lies not in being served, but in serving well what we love." The maids, initially embarrassed by the presence of a lady among them, began to open up. Genevieve listened to their stories, of husbands who worked in the fields, of children battling illnesses, of small but precious dreams, and as she listened, she sewed, her hands moving needle and thread with a grace that turned work into meditation. It was during these conversations that Gideon learned more about her past. He listened through ajar doors unseen, consumed by a curiosity that had become an obsession. Genevieve told Mrs. Caldwell about the years after her mother's death, how she had found her father crying in his office, surrounded by piles of unpaid bills. How at 12 years old, she had taken over the management of the estate because no one else would. How she had learned that tears were a luxury she could not afford, that strength sometimes meant simply continuing when every fiber of her being screamed to give up. "My mother used to say," Genevieve recounted, her voice as soft as faded velvet, "that trials don't weaken us. They only reveal who we have always been beneath the layers of comfort and pretense. When she passed, I discovered who I was. And that discovery, as painful as it was also liberating." Gideon, hidden on the other side of the door, felt something shatter in his chest, a crack in a wall he had spent years building, brick by brick of mistrust. The nights were the hardest. Genevieve would sit in the small solar she had insisted on using instead of the grand drawing room, another economy, with a leather-bound notebook where she jotted down numbers, plans, ideas for generating income. She had organized the maids into a small sewing business, creating simple but well-made items that could be sold in the nearby town. But there was also another, smaller notebook she kept carefully. Gideon, in a moment of weakness that would later shame him deeply, read it when she left to help in the kitchen. The pages contained detailed observations, inconsistencies she had noticed, servants who forgot to maintain the charade when she appeared unexpectedly, correspondence she had intercepted by chance, mentioning transactions that did not align with total ruin, the sold piece of furniture she had seen through an attic window. The last entry, dated the previous night, simply said, "There is something wrong with this story. The pieces do not fit. But perhaps I'm looking for patterns where there is only the chaos of bad luck. Or perhaps no, I will not think of it. I will trust." Love requires trust, even when reason whispers doubts. Gideon closed the notebook with trembling hands. She suspected. Part of her knew. And yet she chose to stay. She chose to trust. She chose to love him despite the cracks in the narrative he had built. In that moment, illuminated by the faint light of a lamp, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal, Gideon Thornbury realized a terrible truth. He wasn't testing her love. He was destroying it. But the machine was already in motion. And some machines, once started, cannot be stopped, only watched as they devour everything in their path, until nothing is left but ashes and regret. There was a secret Genevieve carried like a talisman against despair, a secret she had never fully revealed, not even to Prudence, who had known her since childhood. It was a story she kept in the deepest chamber of her heart, revisiting it on sleepless nights, as if it were a prayer. 6 years earlier, the summer of 1875, Genevieve was 16. The flashback came to her that night at Thornbury Hall like the tide of an ancient sea, brought on by the scent of rain that had begun to fall. She was alone in the solar, her hands resting on unfinished needlework, but her mind had traveled to a time when the world was simultaneously simpler and infinitely more frightening. Her father, Viscount Windermere, was still mired in deep grief over his wife's death. Genevieve had decided to visit her aunt in Westmoreland, hoping the change of scenery would bring relief to them both. The carriage was traveling the road that wound through Witherwood Pass, a region known for its wild beauty and its grim reputation. The trees there grew dense, filtering the sunlight into a golden-green gloom. The air smelled of damp earth and ancient mysteries. The coachman, an old and superstitious man named Thomas, muttered prayers as he guided the horses along the narrow path. The storm arrived without warning. The sky, once porcelain blue, turned black in minutes. Lightning tore through the firmament like the fingers of an angry god. Rain fell in thick sheets, turning the road into treacherous mud. And then they emerged from the shadows, 3 men on horseback, their faces covered with dark kerchiefs, weapons glinting in the flashes of lightning. Highwaymen, the greatest fear of lone travelers. Thomas tried to make the horses run, but one of the bandits fired into the air, startling the animals. The carriage skidded, partially tipping into a muddy ditch. Genevieve was thrown against the inner wall, feeling a cut open on her forehead. Blood mixed with rainwater. The bandits approached. She could see their silhouettes through the broken carriage window, spectral figures moving with the confidence of those who had done this many times before. Thomas tried to protect her, but he was old and unarmed. Genevieve, 16 but already accustomed to facing impossibilities, prepared to fight with the only weapons she had, nails, teeth, and a fierce determination not to die without leaving her mark on her tormentors. But then, through the curtain of rain, another figure emerged. A lone rider on a horse as black as night. He rode as if he were part of the animal, moving with a fluidity that was almost supernatural. His face was partially hidden under a drenched hood, but she saw the glint of his eyes, blue as ice, cold as judgment. What happened next was a blur of motion and violence. The rider did not hesitate. He faced the 3 bandits with a controlled ferocity that was more terrifying than wild rage. He fought with the precision of someone trained in martial arts and the determination of someone with nothing to lose. One of the bandits fell, disarmed. Another was struck by a punch that knocked him from his horse. The third, seeing imminent defeat, fled into the depths of the forest, leaving his unconscious companions behind. And then silence. Only the relentless falling rain. The rider approached the overturned carriage. He extended a hand, a strong hand, scarred in a way that spoke of a life lived without protection. Genevieve accepted it, allowing herself to be helped out of the wreckage. She was soaked, shivering, bleeding, but alive. "Are you injured?" His voice was deep, rough, but there was an underlying kindness to it. "I will survive," Genevieve replied, lifting her chin with a pride that not even terror could eradicate. He looked at her for a long moment, and even through the rain and the shadow of his hood, she saw something pass through those blue eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a recognition of a strength similar to his own. The rider took them, Genevieve and Thomas, to an inn a few miles away. He paid for rooms, food, and medical care, refusing any thanks. When Genevieve tried to ask his name, he just shook his head. "Names do not matter tonight," he said. "All that matters is that you are safe." But as he turned to leave, something fell from his pocket, a silver locket, small but distinct, engraved with a crest, the Thornbury crest. Genevieve picked it up, wanting to return it, but he had already vanished into the rainy night like a ghost, leaving only the sound of hoofbeats fading in the distance. She kept the locket as if it were a sacred relic. For years she tried to learn more about the Thornbury family, driven by a curiosity she couldn't fully explain. It wasn't simple gratitude, it was something deeper, a sense that her destiny was intertwined with that of the mysterious man who had saved her. And then, 6 years later, at the Thornbury estate ball, she saw Lord Gideon Thornbury for the first time. She recognized him immediately, not just by his height or the color of his eyes, but by the scar that cut across his jaw. The same scar she had briefly seen in the flash of lightning in Witherwood Pass, and by the locket he wore that night, identical to the one she kept in her most precious jewelry box. It was him, her savior, the man who had faced 3 armed bandits to protect a stranger. That moment of recognition had been electric, stealing her breath away. When Gideon asked her to dance, she accepted, not just because he was handsome or rich, but because she believed she knew his true character. A man capable of such selfless altruism, she thought, would be incapable of calculated cruelty. How wrong she was. Now sitting in the solar of Thornbury Hall 6 years after that stormy night, Genevieve held the locket she had brought with her, hidden in her jewelry box. She had never told him about Witherwood Pass. She had waited for the right moment, waited for their connection to deepen enough for him to understand the meaning of that rescue. But now, with his financial ruin and her own dedication being tested in ways she was beginning to suspect, Genevieve wondered, was the man who saved her in Witherwood Pass the same one who now seemed to be keeping secrets in his own home? Or was it that we all have different versions of ourselves? The hero who saves strangers, the coward who tests those we love. And if we knew someone by their best moment, would we be able to love them through their worst? The discovery came like an avalanche, not suddenly but inevitably, the result of small pebbles of suspicion that had been rolling for days. Genevieve had always been observant. It was a skill she had developed as a child, when she needed to read the subtleties of her father's moods, to know when to console him, or when to leave him alone with his grief. At Thornbury Hall, that skill had become a different kind of survival tool. She had noticed inconsistencies, servants who forgot to maintain the pretense when she appeared unexpectedly in supposedly closed-off corridors. The gardener who continued to work with exceptionally high-quality tools, not the kind an estate in ruins would keep. The correspondence she had intercepted by chance, mentioning transactions that didn't align with total ruin. And then, the final blow. The sold furniture she had seen through an attic window, simply covered with white sheets like the ghosts of a lie. For a week, Genevieve held her suspicions like dangerous secrets. She continued the performance of a devoted wife facing adversity. Part of her hoped she was wrong. Part of her prayed she was wrong. But the wiser part, the one that had survived her mother's death and years of solitude managing a decaying estate, knew the truth even before she confirmed it. It was on a grey April afternoon that she decided to investigate deliberately. Genevieve positioned herself strategically in the corridor adjacent to Gideon's office, hidden behind a velvet curtain that smelled of mothballs and past generations. She waited as patient as a huntress until she heard voices. Gideon and Lord Tobias Grimsby. Their voices carried through the solid wood door, muffled but understandable. "How much longer will you keep up this charade?" Tobias's voice impatient. "Until I am sure." Gideon tense. "She has passed all your tests, man. She sold her own jewels, she works like a servant. What more proof do you need?" A pause. Genevieve held her breath, each beat of her heart echoing in her ears like a drum. It could still be an act. Gideon's voice was that of a man drowning in his own doubts. "My mother also seemed devoted until she wasn't." "Your mother is a specter that haunts you, Gideon. Don't let her destroy something real because of ghosts." But it was the next sentence that shattered Genevieve's heart into sharp fragments. "She recognized me at the ball." I saw something in her eyes. Gideon paused. "I suspect she knows about Witherwood Pass, that she sought me out because of it, hoping I would feel obligated." Genevieve covered her mouth with her hand, stifling a sound that was part sob, part bitter laugh. So that was it. Not only was the ruin a fake, he suspected her motives, turning even his heroic rescue into an imaginary conspiracy. She did not confront them, not at that moment. Instead, she withdrew silently, each step a conscious decision not to make a sound, not to reveal her presence. She went up to her room, the guest room she had occupied for weeks, never the room that was supposed to be hers as his future wife. Prudence found her sitting by the window, looking out at the gardens where the rain was beginning to fall. The maid knew from her mistress's silence that something fundamental had shifted. "My lady?" Prudence whispered, approaching cautiously. Genevieve didn't turn. Her voice, when she spoke, was strangely calm, the calm of someone who has already cried all their tears in silence and is left with only cold clarity. "Prepare my things, Prudence. Not all of them, just the essentials. And be discreet. Are we leaving, my lady?" "Yes, but first—" Genevieve finally turned, and Prudence saw that her mistress's eyes were dry, but they shone with an iron resolve. "First I will give Lord Thornbury exactly what he asked for. The truth. All of it, until he drowns in it." She spent the night awake organizing documents, the detailed list of all the savings she had implemented, the correspondence she had intercepted and copied, the observations about inconsistencies. She prepared her defense like a general preparing for battle, not to attack, but to make it clear that she was not a fool, not a victim, not the fragile woman he had apparently imagined he was testing. And she kept at the center of it all the locket from Witherwood Pass, the object that had once represented hope, and now represented the death of an illusion. At dawn, Genevieve dressed in her finest attire, not the simple dress she had worn for the past weeks, but the dark green velvet one she had brought for her arrival. An armor of dignity, she pinned her hair into a flawless chignon. She applied a touch of perfume, lavender and rose, the scent her mother used to wear. She prepared herself not for a conversation, but for a war. And in wars, she thought bitterly, there are no victors, only survivors. And Genevieve Windermere had always been excellent at surviving. Genevieve summoned Gideon to the office at 10 in the morning. She didn't ask, she summoned. The reversal of power was intentional, calculated. She arrived first, positioning herself behind the mahogany desk, where generations of Thornburys had conducted business. She spread her documents across the polished surface, like evidence in a courtroom. When Gideon entered, followed hesitantly by Lord Tobias Grimsby, whom she had also summoned, he found a transformed woman, not the soft, understanding Genevieve of the past weeks, but someone he didn't recognize, a judge about to deliver a sentence. "Sit," she said, her voice as cold as the marble statues in the garden. Gideon remained standing, confused. "Genevieve, I don't understand." "Sit," she repeated more firmly, and this time he obeyed, something in her tone awakening a primal instinct to recognize authority when he heard it. She began without preamble, without kindness, without the delicacy he had associated with her. "4 weeks ago you came to this office and told me an elaborate lie about financial ruin." She placed the first document on the table. "Here is the correspondence I intercepted, detailing healthy investments and robust bank accounts. Thornbury Hall was never on the verge of ruin." Gideon paled. Tobias muttered something inaudible. 3 weeks ago," Genevieve continued, her voice a scalpel cutting through lies, "I noticed the servants forgetting to maintain the pretense. Mrs. Caldwell avoided my gaze. The gardeners used tools that impoverished estates would not possess." Another document. "Here is my list of inconsistencies. I realized nearly 10 days ago that something was wrong." "Genevieve," Gideon tried to speak, but she silenced him with a look that could have frozen summer. 2 days ago, I overheard your conversation with Lord Grimsby. I discovered that every moment of false adversity, every tear I shed in private, believing I was helping the man I loved, was a test." Her voice trembled for the first time, but she quickly composed herself. "I was tested as if I were a horse being evaluated for purchase. My devotion, my character, my love, all subjected to a scientific experiment." She turned to Tobias, who had the decency to look ashamed. "Lord Grimsby, thank God you are not the man I almost married. Your participation in this cruelty is worthy of pity, not anger. You are merely a fool influencing another fool." Tobias looked down, but Genevieve had already turned her attention back to Gideon. "But you—" And now there was pain in her voice, pure and unfiltered. "You are something worse. You are a coward." The word hung in the air like a suspended blade. "You hid your mistrust behind elaborate tests instead of simply asking me about my intentions. You chose manipulation over honesty. And worse," she picked up the locket from Witherwood Pass, placing it on the desk with a metallic sound that echoed like a funeral bell. "You even suspected that my recognition of you as my savior was some kind of calculated conspiracy." Gideon stared at the locket, and recognition flashed across his face. "It was you—" "Yes, 6 years ago a man in Witherwood Pass risked his life to save a 16-year-old girl from highwaymen. That man was noble, brave, selfless. Tears finally glistened in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. When I recognized you at the ball, I believed I was meeting that man again. I was mistaken. That man died somewhere between Witherwood Pass and this office, replaced by someone who prefers elaborate games to simple trust." She pushed a stack of papers towards him. "Here is everything I have done these past weeks. Every saving, every sacrifice, every moment I opened my heart, believing I was helping the man I loved. But do you know what is most tragic?" Her voice broke. "I would have done it all anyway. If your ruin had been real, I would have stayed. I would have worked by your side until my fingers bled. I would have sold not just my jewels, but my soul if necessary, because I loved you." Silence. Only the sound of rain falling outside, as if the sky were crying the tears she refused to shed. Genevieve removed the engagement ring, placing it beside the locket. "I cannot marry a man who punishes me for his mother's sins. I cannot build a life with someone who sees betrayal where there is devotion." She looked him directly in the eyes. "Your mother abandoned you, and that is a tragedy. But you have just abandoned yourself, and that is a catastrophe." She moved toward the door but paused, taking a sealed envelope from her pocket. "This letter is to be opened only on the day of your 30th birthday, should that day arrive without me by your side." She placed it on the table. "In it, I have written everything I should have said but didn't, everything I felt but didn't express. Perhaps upon reading it you will understand what you have destroyed here today." Gideon finally found his voice. "Genevieve, I love you." She stopped, her back to him, and when she spoke, her voice was so sad it cut deeper than any anger could have. "Love without trust is a house without a foundation, Gideon, and you have just demolished ours before we even had a chance to live in it." And then she left, leaving behind 2 men, an emerald ring, a silver locket, and the wreckage of something that could have been beautiful. Tobias looked at his friend, finally seeing tears stream down that always controlled face. "What have you done, Gideon?" he whispered. "Good God, what have we done?" But there was no answer, only the sound of a carriage departing in the rain, carrying away the only real thing Gideon Thornbury had ever had. And sometimes when we test what we love, we discover not their character, but the fatal flaw in our own. The first days after Genevieve's departure were for Gideon like navigating through a dense fog. He moved, he breathed, he existed, but without direction, without purpose, without light. Thornbury Hall, once a mansion, had become a mausoleum. Every corridor echoed with absence. The solar where she had sewn was now empty, the unfinished needlework left on a chair like the ghost of dedication. The kitchen, where she had laughed with Mrs. Caldwell, now resonated only with the silence of servants, who looked at him with something between pity and disappointment. In the first week, Gideon swung between anger and self-pity. He filled himself with brandy, blamed Tobias, blamed circumstances, blamed the ghost of his mother. He restored Thornbury Hall to its former glory, rehiring the servants, opening the closed wings, rehanging paintings on the walls. As if by undoing the physical charade, he could also undo the damage he had caused. But the open rooms only amplified the echo of his solitude. Mrs. Caldwell, who had raised him since childhood, sat with him one night, bringing tea he wouldn't drink. "She was different, my lord," the housekeeper said, her voice carrying a gentle reproach. "In all my years serving this family, I've never seen anyone like her." "And you sent her away because you were afraid." "It wasn't fear," Gideon protested weakly. "It was prudence." "Prudence," Mrs. Caldwell repeated with a sigh that held decades of wisdom, "is just another name for cowardice when it's used to avoid the risk of loving." In the second week, driven by growing desperation, Gideon travelled to Windermere Manor. Genevieve's estate was smaller than Thornbury, but it had a dignity money couldn't buy. Well-tended gardens despite limited resources. Walls that needed painting but were clean. Honest poverty, not misery. Viscount Windermere received him coldly in his book-filled office. He was a middle-aged man with greying hair and eyes that had already cried all their tears and were now left only with resignation. "Lord Thornbury," he said without an invitation to sit. "My daughter is in Bath visiting relatives. She specifically asked not to be disturbed." "By anyone?" "Sir, I need to speak with her to explain." "Explain?" The Viscount interrupted, his voice sharp. "My daughter faced armed highwaymen with more courage than you have shown, sir. She at 16 had the bravery to rebuild this estate when I was lost in grief. And you? You had the audacity to test her, as if she were merchandise at a fair." The words hit Gideon like physical blows. He tried to respond, but the old Viscount held up a hand. "Leave, Lord Thornbury. My daughter deserves a man who trusts her, not one who puts her on trial. And until you become that man, if that is even possible, you are not welcome here." The door closed in his face with a finality that echoed like a sentence. In the third week, Gideon sought out Mrs. Ashworth, Genevieve's former governess, who now lived in retirement in the Lake District. The elderly woman received him in a small but cozy cottage with a lavender garden that perfumed the air. She served tea and biscuits, studying him with eyes that had witnessed many human stories. "You want to know about Lady Genevieve?" Mrs. Ashworth said, not as a question but as a statement. "Sit down, young lord. Let me tell you about the girl I raised." For hours Gideon listened, about how Genevieve, at 12, took on responsibilities that should have belonged to adults, how she negotiated with ruthless creditors, her voice not yet fully mature but her determination ironclad. How after the incident at Witherwood Pass she had changed, becoming quieter, more reflective but also stronger. She kept that locket as if it were a sacred relic, Mrs. Ashworth revealed. She didn't speak much of the rescue, but I saw her several times holding it and looking out the window as if expecting that mysterious rider to return. "When she recognized you at the ball," the old woman shook her head. "It wasn't gratitude that motivated her, young man. It was recognition of character. Or what she believed to be your character." "Did she mention suspecting the test?" Gideon asked, his voice hoarse. "She wrote to me a week before she left." Mrs. Ashworth went to a desk, returning with a letter. "You may read it if you wish. She authorized me to show it to you should you seek me out." Genevieve's handwriting was delicate but firm. "Dearest Mrs. Ashworth, something is amiss at Thornbury Hall. There are inconsistencies my reason cannot ignore, though my heart desperately wishes to believe. But do you know what I learned from you and Mama? That true love does not ignore flaws. It faces them with open eyes. If Lord Thornbury is testing me, as I suspect, then he will fail not the test of my devotion, but the test of his own character. And that will be a lesson I cannot teach, only witness." Gideon folded the letter with trembling hands. She had known. Days before the confrontation, she already suspected and had carried on, not out of naivety, but to give him a chance to choose the truth. In the fourth week, he prepared a formal letter renouncing his inheritance. He sat in the same office where the confrontation had occurred and wrote with increasingly uncontrolled handwriting, "To Mr. Bartholomew Fletcher, I renounce the inheritance stipulated by my grandfather. I do not deserve such a fortune, as I have failed the only test that truly mattered, the test of my own heart. But he couldn't finish it. The quill fell from his hand, leaving a blot of ink that looked like black blood on white paper. In the 5th week, finally, Gideon did what he should have done from the beginning. He opened the letter Genevieve had left. Her words cut deeper than any blade. If you are reading this on your birthday without me by your side, know that my absence is not a punishment, but a freedom, for us both. Your grandfather's inheritance required a wife who loved you. I was that woman. But love without trust is a house without a foundation. May you find both, my lord, before it is too late. J.W. Gideon wept then, not the silent tears of self-pity, but deep sobs that shook his entire body, lamenting all he had destroyed, all those he had hurt, the man he could have been, but had chosen not to be. And in the silence of Thornbury Hall, only the clock marked the hours separating him from his 30th birthday. Hours he wasn't sure he deserved to have, because some tests, when we fail them, teach us more than any victory ever could, and some lessons come too late. The eve of Gideon's 30th birthday arrived with a snowstorm that turned Thornbury Hall into an isolated island. White flakes fell like the petals of dead flowers, piling up until they covered gardens, roads, memories. Gideon was alone in the office, that same office that had witnessed so many decisive moments of his lineage. The letter renouncing his inheritance lay on the desk, finally signed that morning. Beside it, the locket from Witherwood Pass that Genevieve had left, and the emerald ring that should have adorned her finger. The fireplace crackled, but it provided no warmth. Nothing seemed capable of thawing the ice that had settled in his chest. That's when he heard it. Distant, almost imaginary, the sound of a carriage struggling through the snow. Gideon went to the window, wiping the fogged glass, certain he was delirious. But he wasn't. A simple carriage was approaching, its horses moving with difficulty through the blizzard. And when it stopped before the main entrance, when a figure wrapped in a heavy cloak stepped out, Gideon felt his heart stop and restart at a different rhythm. Genevieve. She was there, real, covered in snow like an apparition from a dream or a nightmare. He didn't know which. Mrs. Caldwell ran to greet her, exclamations of surprise and concern echoing through the hall. Gideon descended the stairs, each step an eternity. When they finally stood face to face, separated only by cold air and even colder regrets, he could find no words. It was Genevieve who spoke first, her voice firm despite lips blue from the cold. We need to talk. She refused tea, refused warmth, refused any kindness that might soften what she had come to do. In the office, always that doomed office, she removed her cloak, revealing a simple but elegant dress. Her face was thinner, her eyes revealing nights of lost sleep, but there was something new in them too. Clarity, determination, a wisdom earned through pain. I have spent these weeks not just in reflection, Genevieve began, standing while he remained seated, again reversing the power dynamic, but also in investigation. I consulted my father. I sought out Mrs. Ashworth. I corresponded with Mrs. Caldwell, asking about your actions after my departure. Gideon glanced at Mrs. Caldwell, who had the decency to look slightly guilty. And what did you discover? His voice was hoarse, unused. That you were repentant, that you looked for me, that you prepared to renounce the inheritance. She paused. But repentance is not enough, Gideon. Change is necessary. She opened a bag she had brought, taking out documents. She spread them on the desk with precise movements. If we are to marry, and her voice trembled on the word if, it will be under these conditions. Non-negotiable. Gideon stared at the papers, stunned by the word marry. She hadn't given up on him completely. First, Genevieve pointed to the first document, complete transparency in all financial and personal matters. No more secrets, no more tests, no more lies, not even well-intentioned ones. I agree, he said immediately. Second, she continued, ignoring the interruption, monthly meetings to openly discuss our marriage, our fears, our hopes, our failures. We will create a space where truth is more important than comfort. Yes? Third, and here she placed a different, more formal document, a prenuptial contract that guarantees my financial independence. I know it is radical for 1881, but I will not enter a marriage where I am dependent on someone who might at any moment decide to test me again. Gideon took the document, reading it. It was exhaustive, fair, and completely contrary to all the social norms of the era. It guaranteed her separate property, her own income, and the right to make financial decisions independently of him. Was it your father who helped you with this? It was. A small smile touched her lips. He may be lost in his grief, but he is still a man who believes women should have control over their own destinies. Gideon looked at her, truly looked for the first time in weeks. He saw the woman who had faced highwaymen, who had managed an estate at 12, who had spent weeks believing she was working to save the man she loved, only to discover she was part of a cruel charade. And yet, there she was, offering him a second chance he didn't deserve. "Why?" he asked, his voice broken. "After everything I've done, why are you here?" Genevieve drew closer, and for the first time since she had arrived, she allowed emotion to show on her face. "Because in these past weeks I learned something. I learned that to forgive is not to forget. I learned that true love doesn't ignore flaws but chooses to work through them." Tears welled in her eyes. "And I learned that the man who saved me in Witherwood Pass and the man who tested me at Thornbury Hall are the same person, flawed, scared, capable of both nobility and cruelty, like all of us." She held out her hand, and Gideon saw she was holding the emerald ring. "But this only works if you choose truth above all else, even when it hurts, even when it's inconvenient, even when your fears whisper lies." Gideon took the ring, but before placing it back on her finger, he took a quill and signed the prenuptial contract without hesitation. "Marry me tomorrow," he said, "not because of the inheritance, not because of the deadline, but because I don't want to spend a single day longer than necessary without you by my side." Genevieve looked at the snow falling outside, so different from the rain of Witherwood Pass, but just as transformative. "Tomorrow," she agreed. "But remember, I am choosing to trust you again. Do not waste this gift, Gideon. There will not be a third." And in the snowstorm that isolated Thornbury Hall from the world, two wounded hearts made the bravest choice to try again. The dawn of Gideon's 30th birthday arrived in a silent white. The storm had passed during the night, leaving Thornbury Hall wrapped in an immaculate shroud of snow. The entire world seemed to have been reborn, cleansed, transformed into a blank page where new stories could be written. The private chapel at Thornbury was cold despite the lit fireplace. It was a small structure, built 3 generations ago, with stained glass windows that filtered the morning light into shades of blue and gold. Oak pews lined 2 simple rows, and a modest altar waited beneath an ancient wooden crucifix. There would be no grand celebration, no hundreds of guests, just 5 witnesses. Mrs. Caldwell, who had cried while helping Genevieve dress, whispering that she had always known she was special. Lord Tobias Grimsby, who had arrived before dawn, riding through the snow to apologize publicly and offer his services. Prudence, Genevieve's loyal maid, who held a simple bouquet of evergreens, the only flowers they could find in the snow-covered garden. Viscount Windermere, who had travelled through the night, determined not to let his daughter marry without him present, his differences with Gideon tempered by a reluctant respect for the courage to admit a mistake, and Mr. Bartholomew Fletcher, who would arrive later to finalize legal documents, but whose presence was already felt in the weight of the moment. Genevieve descended the stairs of Thornbury Hall, dressed not in the elaborate wedding gown they had originally planned, but in a simple ivory silk suit, the same one her mother had worn at her own wedding. No veil, no jewels beyond a simple brooch, her hair loose and falling over her shoulders. A bride without pretense, only truth. When Gideon saw her, standing at the chapel altar, something inside him broke and was remolded simultaneously. She was beautiful not because of ornamentation, but because of the transparent courage in every step she took toward him. The local vicar, Father Morrison, an elderly man with white hair and a gentle voice, had conducted baptisms, weddings, and funerals for the Thornburys for 40 years. He looked at the couple with eyes that had seen many unions, some happy, some convenient, many desperate. But there was something different about this one. "We are gathered," he began, his voice echoing softly off the stone walls, "on a day of rebirth. The snow outside reminds us that God in his mercy always offers us the opportunity to begin again." Genevieve and Gideon stood face to face, their hands touched, cold, trembling, but firm in their determination. Before the traditional vows, Tobias Grimsby asked for permission to speak. He approached, addressing Genevieve directly. "Lady Windermere, I have sinned against you by advising my friend in this cruel charade. I have no right to your forgiveness, but I ask for it nonetheless. Not for myself, but so that this marriage may begin without the shadows of unforgiven parties." Genevieve studied him for a long moment. Then, in a firm voice, "Lord Grimsby, I accept your apology, But know that forgiveness is not forgetting. Strive to be better than you were. It is all any of us can do." Tobias nodded, retreating with unexplained tears shining in his eyes. The vows were spoken, not just the traditional words, but also words they had written together the night before. "I promise," Gideon said, his voice breaking, "to be worthy of the trust you offer me. I promise to choose truth even when lies are more convenient. I promise to recognize when my fears speak louder than my reason, and I promise every day to work to be the man you deserve, not the one my past ghosts have created." "I promise," Genevieve replied, "not to allow the wound you caused to become a wall between us. I promise to speak when silence would be easier. I promise to remind you of who you are at your best, when you are lost in your worst. And I promise to rebuild with you something stronger than what was broken." The emerald ring slid onto her finger, not for the first time, but for the first time with its full meaning. And beside it, Gideon placed a simple gold band engraved on the inside with words only the two of them would see. "From the ashes, renewal." The kiss that sealed the union was different from the first one at the ball. It was not a celebration of something beginning, but an acknowledgement of something that had survived. It was salty with tears, hers impossible to distinguish. When Mr. Fletcher finally arrived, having fought through the snow that still made the roads difficult, he found them signing documents in the office, that damned and now redeemed office. "The condition of the inheritance has been met," Fletcher declared, adjusting his spectacles. "Lord Thornbury, you have married before your 30th birthday to a woman who unquestionably loves you for yourself." But Gideon barely heard him. He took the letter of renunciation he had prepared, and along with the false documents from the test, threw them all into the fireplace. The fire eagerly devoured the paper, turning lies into ashes that rose up the chimney like dark prayers. Genevieve watched, then removed the prenuptial contract. She kept a signed copy as they had agreed, and placed it carefully beside the locket from Witherwood Pass in her memory box. She didn't burn it. She didn't hide it, because, as she had explained to Gideon, scars are reminders, not punishments. We keep what has taught us, not to torture ourselves, but so we do not forget the lessons. Mrs. Caldwell served a modest but loving dinner. There was no orchestra, no ball, no hundreds of curious guests, just the people who truly mattered, sharing bread and wine around a table, speaking honestly about flaws and forgiveness, about love and trust, about how to build something lasting on foundations that have already been shaken. Viscount Windermere raised his glass, looking at his son-in-law with eyes that were both a warning and an acceptance. "To the courage to admit a mistake, to my daughter's wisdom in offering a second chance, and to the hard work that lies ahead for you both, because true love is not found. It is built brick by brick, choice by choice, truth by truth." Night fell on Thornbury Hall, and the snow continued to gleam under the full moon. In the room that was now officially theirs, Genevieve and Gideon stood by the window, watching the transformed world. "Are you afraid that I will fail again?" he asked softly. "Yes," she answered with an honesty that was both painful and liberating. "But I am more afraid of never trying. Fear that paralyzes us is more destructive than fear that makes us move forward with caution." He held her, and she allowed it. But it was not the embrace of a fairy tale where everything is instantly healed. It was the embrace of two wounded people, choosing to carry each other through the storm. Because marriages are not made at the altar, but in the days that follow, when we choose repeatedly to honor the promises we made when everything seemed possible. The first days of marriage were, surprisingly, the most difficult. Not for lack of love, but for an excess of awareness. Every word weighted with meaning, every silence charged with memories of past betrayals. Genevieve suggested they begin by symbolically rebuilding the office where so much pain had been caused. Not physically. The walls would remain, the furniture would stay, but energetically transforming it from a courtroom of judgment into a sanctuary of truth. They worked together, removing objects that carried a negative emotional weight. The desk where the test had been planned was moved to a different position, now facing the window that offered a view of the gardens, reminding them that they should always look outside themselves, not into their own paranoia. They hung the signed prenuptial contract on the wall, framed under glass, not as evidence of mistrust, but as a reminder of commitments kept. Beside it, the locket from Witherwood Pass, symbols of who they were then and who they chose to be now. Lord Tobias Grimsby visited a week after the wedding, bringing an unexpected offer. "I know I do not deserve your trust," he said to both of them, sitting uncomfortably in the drawing room, "but I would like to offer my service. I will be your guardian of honesty." Someone you can consult when there are doubts, when fears whisper lies. A third point of view to remind you of your commitments. Genevieve and Gideon exchanged glances. It was a bizarre offer, born of guilt and intertwined friendship. But there was wisdom in it too. Sometimes couples need an external voice to help them navigate turbulent waters. "We accept," Genevieve replied, "but on one condition: you will be brutally honest with us even when the truth is uncomfortable." "Especially then." Tobias nodded, looking relieved to have a purpose in his penance. The first honesty meetings, as they called their monthly gatherings, were painful. Gideon admitted that he still occasionally felt paranoia creeping up his spine when Genevieve did something unexpected. He confessed that his first reaction was mistrust, though he consciously fought against it. Genevieve in turn admitted that there were moments when she looked at him and saw not her husband, but the man who had orchestrated the cruel charade. Moments when the wound throbbed like a poorly healed bone on a cold day. "But," she added, holding his hand, "I acknowledge these reactions, I name them, and then I choose to move beyond them. They are not truth, they are just echoes of pain. And echoes eventually fade." Father Morrison visited monthly, offering not religious sermons but honest conversations about the nature of forgiveness, about how to build trust on broken ground. "Trust," he said during one of these visits, "is not naivety. It is not closing your eyes to the possibility of pain. It is choosing to be vulnerable anyway, knowing the risks full well. And that, my children, is the bravest form of love." Mrs. Caldwell, now semi-retired but still living at Thornbury Hall, became a confidant to both. She, who had witnessed generations of Thornburys, offered a perspective that only decades of life could provide. "Love is not linear," she said one afternoon, as she helped Genevieve plant rose bushes in the garden. "It ebbs and flows, it grows, and sometimes it withers. But if you keep watering it, nurturing it, protecting it from the worst storms, eventually it blooms again, different perhaps, scarred, but beautiful in ways that untouched love could never be." The months passed. Spring gave way to summer. The rose bushes Genevieve had planted began to bud, small green leaves defying the still cold soil. Gideon watched her tend to them with religious dedication, and he saw parallels she never verbalized: consistent care, patience with slow growth, faith that something beautiful would eventually emerge. They established rituals. Every Sunday night, they dined alone without servants, preparing the food together and talking about the week. Every Saturday morning, they walked the grounds no matter the weather, reminding themselves that marriage was a journey, not a destination. And slowly, so slowly it was hard to notice the change from day to day, something transformed. The silences between them were no longer charged with tension, but comfortable. Their touches no longer had to be thought out, calculated, conscious. They began to flow naturally, like water finding its path. It was at the end of summer that Genevieve revealed she was pregnant. They were in the garden, among the rose bushes that were now in full bloom, deep red roses that perfumed the air with an almost unbearable sweetness. "Gideon," she said softly, "there is something I need to tell you." He felt a moment of old fear, that automatic response that "something I need to tell you" meant trouble. But he took a breath, acknowledged the reaction, and chose to wait. "I'm expecting a child." The world stopped. Then it restarted in more vivid colors. Gideon knelt before her, his hands trembling as he gently touched her still flat abdomen. "A child," he whispered. "Our child. Are you afraid?" she asked, her hands stroking his hair. "Terrified," he admitted with an honesty that now came more easily. "Afraid of failing, of repeating past mistakes, of being the father my father was, of not being a good enough father." "Me too," Genevieve confessed. "But I have something stronger than fear. I have hope. Hope that our failures have taught us how not to fail again. That our child will grow up seeing not perfection, but honest effort. And that, I believe, is a more valuable education." That night, in the office that was now a sanctuary and not a courtroom, they wrote a letter to their unborn child. "Dearest child, you will be born into an imperfect world, to imperfect parents. We will make mistakes, many of them. We will fail in ways we cannot even predict. But we promise you this: we will always choose truth over convenience. We will always admit when we are wrong. We will always strive to be better tomorrow than we are today. And we will teach you not that love is easy, or that trust is guaranteed, but that both are worth every painful effort, every difficult choice, every terrifying moment of vulnerability. You are the fruit not only of love, but of forgiveness, of a new beginning, of a stubborn hope that refuses to give up, even when it would be easier. Welcome to the world, little one. It is more beautiful because you are coming." They sealed the letter and stored it with the locket and the contract, trophies not of perfection, but of survival. of a love that had chosen to stay when it could have left. And sometimes that choice, to stay to try to believe again, is the closest that humans come to the divine. Winter returned, bringing with it not just snow, but a letter that would make Gideon face his ultimate test, not one imposed by him, but by fate. Lady Catherine Thornbury, his mother who had left when he was 7, who had left physical and emotional scars, who had been the ghost haunting his every decision, was dying, and she was asking to see him. The letter arrived on a frigid December morning, delivered by a special messenger. Genevieve was 8 months pregnant, radiant despite the growing discomfort. She saw the expression on his face as he read it, and with the intuition she had developed, knew that something fundamental was about to change. "It's from her," Gideon said simply, his voice hollow. He didn't need to explain who her was. The letter was short, written in a hand he didn't recognize, trembling, weakened by time and illness. "My son, I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I am dying and there are words I must say before it is too late. I do not seek forgiveness, I cannot expect such grace. Only truth. If you can come, I'm at the Ashford estate in Hampshire. Your mother, Catherine." Genevieve sat beside him in silence for a long time. Finally, "You need to go." "No," he replied immediately, old anger bubbling up. "She doesn't deserve—" "This isn't about what she deserves," Genevieve interrupted gently. "It's about what you need. Gideon, look at me." He obeyed, meeting her brown eyes, which were full of a wisdom that seemed ancient. "Your entire life has been defined by her absence. Every decision, every fear, every cruel test you imposed on me, all of it can be traced back to that morning she left." She held his hands. "If you don't go, if you don't listen to what she has to say, she will continue to be the ghost that haunts you. But if you go, maybe you can finally lay her to rest. Not the woman, but the power she holds over you. And if—" Gideon choked on the words, "what if I forgive her and she doesn't deserve it?" "Then you will have forgiven her anyway," Genevieve replied, "and that will free you, not her. Forgiveness is not a gift for the one who hurt us, Gideon. It is a gift to ourselves." The journey to Hampshire took 2 days through treacherous winter roads. Lord Tobias insisted on accompanying him, fulfilling his role as the guardian of honesty. Genevieve couldn't travel due to her advanced pregnancy, but she wrote him a letter to take. "My love, remember, to listen is not to agree. To understand is not to forgive, but both are necessary for true healing. Go with an open but not naive heart. Hear what she has to say, then choose what to do with those words. I will be here awaiting your return, and when you come back, no matter what you discover, we will process it together. You are not alone on this journey, even when we are physically apart. With love and trust, Genevieve." The Ashford estate in Hampshire was smaller than Thornbury Hall, but it had a melancholy elegance. Dormant winter gardens, a grey stone house that seemed to be sighing, waiting for something to end. The butler, an elderly man with sad eyes, led Gideon to a room on the 2nd floor. The curtains were partially drawn, filtering the grey afternoon light, and there, in a bed that seemed too large for the frail figure occupying it, was Lady Catherine Thornbury. Gideon almost didn't recognize her. The woman who had left 23 years ago was beautiful, vibrant, full of life and ambition. The woman before him was a spectre. Hair that was once golden was now as white as the snow falling outside, her face marked with deep wrinkles that spoke not of laughter, but of regret. Only her eyes remained the same, blue like his but faded by illness and time. "Gideon," she whispered, her voice as rough as dry leaves. "You came." He remained by the door, unable to approach. The scar on his jaw pulsed, a physical memory of their last night together. "I did not come to give forgiveness," he said, his voice cold. "I came because my wife is wiser than I am, and suggested I needed to hear what you have to say." A sad smile touched her lips. "Your wife is wise indeed. Sit, please. I do not have much time, and there is much to say." Reluctantly, he sat in the chair beside the bed, maintaining a physical distance, even in that forced proximity. Catherine began to speak, and her story came out in painful fragments. "I married your father for love," she began, surprising him. "I know you don't believe it, but it was true. He was kind, generous, everything a young dreamer could wish for. But I was sick in a way that had no name back then." She paused, breathing with difficulty. "Today they might call it severe melancholy, perhaps. A darkness that would descend upon me without warning, that turned every joy to ash. Your father tried to help, but in those days women who spoke of their mental afflictions were considered hysterical, weak. So I suffered in silence, and that silence poisoned me." Gideon listened, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "When you were born," Catherine continued, "I thought motherhood would cure me, but it got worse. I would look at your perfect face and feel nothing. an emptiness where love should have been. And that emptiness terrified me so much that I began to run, first into fantasies, then in search of anything that would make me feel something. Tears began to stream down her wrinkled cheeks. I met Lord Ashford at a ball. He promised a different life, a luxury that would drown my emptiness. And I, desperate and sick, believed him. The night I left, you woke up. Do you remember? Gideon nodded stiffly, the memory burning like a hot iron. You were crying, begging me to stay. And her voice broke. I gathered my things so quickly that I knocked over the lamp. When the oil caught fire and burned your face, when I heard you scream, I should have stayed. I should have held you, sought help. But the monster inside me said to keep walking. And that's what I did. She covered her face with hands that were almost transparent. But the new life brought no relief. The emptiness followed me. Lord Ashford became cruel when he realized wealth couldn't cure me. I spent years on distant estates, isolated, medicated with laudanum that only made everything worse. And all that time I thought of you, of the boy I abandoned, the scar I caused, the love I couldn't give because I was too empty to find it. Why? Gideon finally exploded, his voice cracking. Why tell me this now? So I'll feel pity, so you can absolve your conscience before you die. No, Catherine replied, looking him directly in the eye. I am telling you this so you do not repeat my mistakes. I heard about your test, Gideon, about what you did to that young woman. He froze. How? Even on my deathbed, I still have sources in society. And when I heard, she winced in pain, I recognized myself in you. Not the illness, but the fear. The fear that makes you destroy what you love before it destroys you. The fear that turns love into a test, trust into a prison. She held out a trembling hand, and after a moment's hesitation, he took it. I did not come seeking forgiveness, my son. I came to give you something I never had, the truth. I was sick. I made terrible choices. I caused irreparable pain, but my illness was not caused by a lack of love from your father or by your existence. It was mine. And you are not me. Tears streamed down Gideon's face, tears that held decades of confusion, anger, and pain. Your wife stayed, Catherine continued. Even when cruelly tested, she stayed. Not because she is weak or desperate, but because she is strong enough to see past your fears. Do not waste that, Gideon. Do not let my ghosts destroy your chance at happiness. They remained that way for hours, a dying mother and a wounded son, talking about everything that had never been said. She told him stories he didn't know, how she had followed him from afar, learning of his accomplishments through letters from friends, how she had cried when she learned he had become a good man in spite of her, not because of her, and when she finally passed away 3 days later, with Gideon holding her hand, she whispered her final words, Love your wife without fear. Love your child who is to come with a whole heart. Be the father that I could not be a mother. And in that way perhaps something good can be born from all the ashes. Gideon returned to Thornbury Hall a changed man, not healed, wounds that deep don't heal completely but different, understanding that his mother had been not just the villain of his story, but a sick, terrified woman, failing in ways she herself did not understand, and understanding too that he had choices she hadn't. He had Genevieve, he had truth. He had the opportunity to break cycles instead of perpetuating them. When he arrived home, Genevieve was waiting, even though it was nearly midnight. She stood up, slowly due to her pregnancy, and simply opened her arms. Gideon walked into that embrace and wept. He wept for the mother he had lost twice. He wept for the 7-year-old boy who never understood why he wasn't enough. He wept for the man who had almost destroyed everything because of inherited fears. And Genevieve held him, whispering not empty words of comfort but truths. She is gone. The ghosts have lost their power. And now, my love, you are free to be whoever you choose to be. And sometimes freedom comes not from forgetting the past, but from finally understanding it enough to let it go. Rosalind Genevieve Thornbury was born on a spring morning, when the rose bushes her mother had planted exploded into blossoms that perfumed the whole of Thornbury Hall. Her first cry echoed through the ancient walls like a proclamation. Life went on, renewed, full of possibilities. Gideon held his daughter for the first time, with hands that trembled not with fear but with reverent awe. She was tiny, perfect, with eyes that hadn't yet decided on their final color, but that looked at him with complete trust, the trust that only newborns have, before they learn the world can disappoint. She is ours, he whispered, marveling. Real here. Genevieve, exhausted but radiant, smiled. And she will never know the weight of unspoken fears or cruel tests. She will know only truth even when it hurts. Especially then. The first years of parenthood were a revelation. Gideon discovered that love for a child was different from any other, fierce, protective, but also terrifying in its vulnerability. Every cry in the night woke him in a panic. Every childhood illness left him sleepless. "It's normal," Mrs. Caldwell would assure him, now officially promoted to nanny and family advisor. "Every father fears he will fail, but fear that moves you to be better is different from fear that paralyzes you. You are on the right path." Charles Edmund Thornbury was born 2 years later, during a surprisingly mild winter. He was different from Rosalind from the start. Where she was contemplative, he was tempestuous. Where she studied the world with serious eyes, he attacked it with chaotic enthusiasm. Genevieve joked that they had one child from each of them. Rosalind had inherited her reflective nature, while Charles had taken Gideon's intensity. And together, they were perfect precisely in their imperfections. The Genevieve Thornbury School for Girls opened its doors in their 3rd year of marriage. It started small, just 10 students in a converted drawing room at Thornbury Hall. But the philosophy was revolutionary, to teach girls not just embroidery and piano, but mathematics, financial management, and negotiation, to give them the tools to be independent, not just ornamental. Society murmured in scandal, but when the first students graduated and began managing family estates with an efficiency that surprised even experienced men, the murmurs turned into applications for admission. In 5 years, there were 4 locations. In 10, it would be nationally recognized. Gideon had implemented his own reforms. He introduced progressive agricultural techniques, treated tenants as partners rather than serfs, and created a microloan program for local families to start small businesses. The Thornbury estate became a model of how nobility could use privilege, not just to enrich themselves, but to uplift others. Lord Tobias Grimsby had married, surprisingly, a teacher from Genevieve's school, an intelligent, untitled woman who challenged him constantly. He credited his transformation to the example he had seen at Thornbury Hall, that marriages based on mutual respect were not only possible, but superior in every way. "You are responsible for my happiness," he told Gideon during a dinner. "Paradoxically, by demonstrating my error, you gave me the opportunity to change, a strange form of gift, but an effective one." The honesty meetings continued over the years. Initially monthly, they eventually became quarterly, then annual. Not because they were less necessary, but because the practice of truth had become so integrated into their marriage that it no longer needed a formal structure. But on every wedding anniversary, Genevieve and Gideon performed their private ritual. They reviewed the year, celebrated growths, acknowledged failures, and reaffirmed their commitments. And always, the pre-nuptial contract was mentioned, not as a legal document, but as the symbol of mutual respect that was the foundation of everything. There were difficult moments. Years when Gideon struggled with resurgent paranoia, when the old fears whispered lies during sleepless nights. Genevieve had learned to recognize the signs, his subtle withdrawal, questions that tried to seem casual but were loaded with suspicion. In those moments, she didn't confront him with anger, but with gentle firmness. "It's happening again, isn't it? The ghosts have returned," and he, trained by years of practice, had learned to acknowledge and name it. "Yes, I'm afraid that," he would take a deep breath, "I'm afraid that one day you will wake up and realize you could have done better, that I am not worth the effort you've invested." An understandable fear, she would reply, always honest, but not one based in reality. And when your fears speak, remember, they are echoes of the past, not prophecies of the future. There were also times when Genevieve struggled, when the memory of the test resurfaced in dreams, when she would wake with a racing heart, remembering how she had been manipulated. She admitted these struggles too, because to hide them would be a betrayal of the principles they had built. Sometimes, she confessed one night years later, "I still feel the pain, like an old scar that aches when the weather changes. It's not constant, it doesn't define my life, but it exists. And I need you to know, I have forgiven, but I have not forgotten. And that is acceptable." "It is more than acceptable," Gideon had answered. "It is honest. And honesty is what keeps us real." When Rosalind was 5, she asked about a glass box in her father's office. Inside it, carefully preserved, was the letter Genevieve had written before their confrontation. The letter Gideon had opened on the eve of his 30th birthday. "What is this, Papa?" she asked, her small voice curious. Gideon looked at Genevieve, who nodded. Together they knelt to their daughter's level. "It's a letter your mother wrote to me when I almost lost her," Gideon explained. "We keep it here so we never forget that the truth, even when it hurts, is always better than the most beautiful of lies." "Why would you lose her?" Rosalind frowned, confused. "Because," Genevieve answered, choosing her words carefully, "Papa was afraid. And when people are afraid, Sometimes they do foolish things that hurt the ones they love. But you love Papa now? Yes, my love, very much. But that love had to be rebuilt. Like a house that almost collapsed but was restored brick by brick. And now it is stronger because we know how to take care of it. Charles, then 3, didn't understand the adult conversation, but he sensed its importance. He came closer, tucking his small hand into Gideon's. Strong house, he declared with the absolute certainty that young children possess. Yes, my son, Gideon replied, his voice thick with emotion. A strong house. In the office that had once been a place of cruel tests, the locket from Witherwood Pass now hung beside the framed prenuptial contract. Below them a small plaque that Genevieve had commissioned. From the ashes, renewal. From fear, courage. From pain, wisdom. May those who enter here remember, true love is not tested, it is lived daily, in small and large choices for the truth. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Gideon and Genevieve held a ball at Thornbury Hall, not as grand as the one where they had met, but more meaningful. They invited not only aristocrats, but also former students from the school, families of tenants who had prospered under Gideon's programs, and servants who had become part of their extended family. During the waltz, the same music that had played during their first dance, Genevieve whispered, "Do you know what amazes me? That I still choose to love you, not out of obligation, not out of habit, but by a conscious daily choice. And that choice becomes easier every year, even after everything?" Gideon asked, though he already knew the answer. "Especially after everything," she corrected, "because I know exactly who you are, your best moments and your worst. And I choose to love the whole, not just the easy pieces." He spun her around, and for a moment they were young again at the ball, full of intertwined hope and terror. But now they had something those young people did not. History, scars, wisdom earned through nearly losing everything. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "Choosing me despite it all?" Genevieve stopped dancing, looking him directly in the eyes with that honesty that had become the hallmark of their love. "I regret what we suffered. I regret that we had to learn through pain. But do I regret what we have built? Never. Because this," she gestured to the ballroom full of people they loved, to their children dancing with friends, to the life they had created together. "This is real, earned, ours." And in that moment, Gideon Thornbury understood a final truth. The greatest test had not been the one he imposed on Genevieve, nor the confrontation with his dying mother, nor the years of rebuilding trust. The greatest test was waking up every day and choosing to be worthy of the love he received. And in that test, the only one that truly mattered, he was finally passing. The years went on. Rosalind became an exceptional administrator, eventually taking over the Genevieve Thornbury School and expanding it beyond what her mother had dreamed. Charles, to everyone's surprise, became a doctor, dedicated to understanding and treating diseases of the mind, an indirect legacy of the grandmother he had never known. Gideon and Genevieve grew old together, their hair turning white, their steps becoming slower but their hands always intertwined. On their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and a community they had helped transform, they sat in the garden where the rose bushes now grew wild and beautiful. "It was worth it," Genevieve said, not as a question but as a statement. "Every moment," Gideon agreed. "Every tear, every fear overcome, every difficult choice for the truth. It was all worth it to get here with you still." And when their time finally came to depart, first him, years later her, they left behind not just estates and titles, but something more valuable, a lineage of people who learned that true love is not the absence of flaws, but the commitment to facing them together. The locket from Witherwood Pass and the prenuptial contract remained at Thornbury Hall, passed down from generation to generation, reminders that the best marriages are not those without storms, but those that learn to dance in the rain, and on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the ancient halls. Some swear they can hear the sound of a waltz, two souls dancing eternally, always choosing each other, life after life, truth after truth, because in the end, the greatest test of the heart is not to prove love, but to live it.